For years he had dreamed of this moment, all through the terrible times, the fights with his father, the desperate years in prison. Now finally he was here. The new world, a chance to throw off the chains of the old and create a new society framed in freedom. Even though he had already traveled 3,000 miles, for William Penn, the adventure had just begun.
From Philadelphia, PA, the city of brotherly love, the founding father himself, Mr. William Penn.
And now, my dear children, hear my counsel, and lay it up in your hearts.
Okay, so he's not really alive, but what he has to say is still pretty darn lively. Hi, I'm Elise, and I've come to Pennsylvania to hear Mr. Penn's advice, or counsel as he puts it, and to find out how he changed the course of American history. What, you don't think one guy could have done that? Well, Mr. Penn was special. He took amazing risks to stand up for what he believed in. And one of the things he believed in was being a Quaker, which is why I've come here, to a Quaker meeting house, to hunt for clues about him. Meet Bill Kashadis, historian and teacher. Bill, how do we get started?
Well, one of the first things to remember is that one of the most dangerous things that William Penn ever did in his life was to become a Quaker.
You're a Quaker, and you don't seem to be in any danger. Why was it so risky for Penn?
It's not very dangerous to be a Quaker now, but over 300 years ago, it was a very different story. It all began when William Penn was just a little bit older than you, Elise. He was born in London, England in 1644 to a life of wealth and privilege. His father was an admiral in the Royal Navy and a war hero. Admiral Penn had high hopes that young Penn would become a courtier, a fashionable person who spent a lot of time at court, in this case with King Charles II. In preparation for the life of a fine gentleman, his son was sent to the best schools. But while studying at the famous English university, Oxford, William Penn got into trouble. He and his friends broke the school rules that had been set by their dean, Dr. Fell. Maybe you know the nursery rhyme one of Penn's friends wrote about the dean.
I do not like the Dr. Fell. The reason why I cannot tell. But this I know and know full well. I do not like the Dr. Fell.
The main reason Dr. Fell was unpopular was that he forced Penn and his friends to go to the college's chapel every morning, even though they didn't want to. They decided to hold their own prayer meetings instead.
For skipping church, William was kicked out of school. Boy, was his dad mad.
He whipped and beat me and turned me out of the house. When the admiral had cooled down, he decided to take another try at turning his son into a courtier. He sent him to Europe, then law school, and finally to manage his castle in Ireland. And that's where William Penn really rebelled. He was just 22 when, for the second time in his life, Penn heard a Quaker speak. The preacher described a way of life guided by an inner light and based on simplicity, peace, and equality. Nothing could have been more different from the life the admiral had planned for his son, and nothing appealed to young Penn more.
Now that we're on the topic, what's with this name Quaker? I keep getting an image of earthquakes in my head.
Originally, Quakers called themselves Friends of Truth, or just friends. But their founder, George Fox, preached with such emotion that he actually trembled. Other Englishmen thought that the trembling was strange, so they called the Friends Quakers.
Bill, could you tell me why William couldn't be both? A courtier like his father wanted, and a Quaker at the same time?
It would have been very difficult to be both. Quakers believed that all people are equal in the eyes of God. Quakers wouldn't even take their hats off to a king, and that's pretty dangerous stuff back in the 1600s when most people believed that the king had a God-given right to rule.
I bet the king got mad when the Quakers disrespected him like that.
He certainly did. In fact, when the Quakers gathered to worship, they'd be hauled off to jail. Their property and their possessions would be taken away from them. Even before they got to jail, they'd be beaten. And the jails were so filthy that many Quakers died in prison.
What happened to William Penn?
Like his fellow Quakers, William Penn also went to prison. But he was an educated man and a lawyer. He gave his suffering a voice. While in jail, Penn published pamphlets that said all men should have freedom of religion and equal justice under the law, which just earned him more time in prison. But I vowed that my prison will be my grave before I budge a jot, for I owe my conscience to no mortal man, but only to God.
What does he mean he doesn't owe his conscience to any mortal man?
That's a very good question. Penn believed that a king, a church, or anyone for that matter, shouldn't tell a person what they should believe. Instead, the person should be allowed to decide what they want to believe for themselves.
It must have really upset his dad that the son he wanted to be a courtier was in jail instead.
Well, he was angry at first, but the admiral came to respect his son for defending his convictions. And shortly before the admiral passed away, father and son made up.
I'm glad he did. Wander now into the dark passages of time, where super sleuths pry away the centuries to uncover a history mystery. The case of the Quaker soldier. Okay, history buffs, this one's a toughie, but I think you'll probably figure it out. This might be the only formal painting made of William Penn while he was alive. It was done in Ireland just as William was becoming a Quaker. So what's wrong with this picture? I'll give you some hints. Quakers are pacifists. They don't believe in violence. And Quakers dress plainly. They think fancy things get in the way of a relationship with God. In this picture, Penn looks more like a soldier than he does a Quaker. So did he completely reject his father's world for Quakerism? That will probably always remain a history mystery.
At the time of his death, Admiral Penn, William's father, was owed a great deal of money by King Charles. William Penn went to the king and said that instead of cash, he was willing to take his inheritance in the form of property in the New World. He dreamed of starting a colony there with other Quakers. Both sides were happy with this solution. The king would be rid of a huge debt and the troublesome Quakers, while Penn and his friends would finally be able to worship as they pleased without being punished. William Penn was thrilled. It is a tract of land almost as large as all of England itself, and it promises those who settle there freedom from the religious intolerance, the king's judgments, and the violence of this old world.
The name of the new colony? Pennsylvania.
Imagine inheriting all this land with lots of woods and the beautiful Delaware River rolling out to the sea. In time, Penn would sell much of it to his settlers, but he kept this piece, Pennsbury Manor, for himself.
It's beautiful. Penn this and Penn that. Doesn't seem very humble or Quaker-like to name a gigantic colony after yourself.
No, it really doesn't. But William Penn didn't name the colony Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods in Latin. King Charles named the colony after William's late father, the admiral.
Did William name any parts of the colony?
Well, actually, the first name that he chose was for his capital city, Philadelphia, which roughly means the city of brotherly love in Greek. In his new colony, William Penn and his friends wanted to put Quaker principles into practice. He considered Pennsylvania to be a holy experiment.
We interrupt this story to bring you an important news bulletin.
Hey, does anybody around here know what time it is?
It's about time. Let's take a quick look at some of the key events that paved William Penn's path to America. In 1607, The first English colony was started at Jamestown. 23 years later, the Puritans began settling the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1644, William Penn was born. He became a Quaker at the age of 23. When he was 37, he inherited one of the largest parcels of land in all of America. The very next year, he set sail aboard a ship called the Welcome for his new colony.
That's right, Elise. But Penn's beloved wife, Juliana Springett Penn, couldn't come with him because of an illness in the family. Perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. Nearly a third of the passengers died of smallpox on the voyage.
That's awful.
When William Penn finally reached Pennsylvania, his colonists gave him a twig, a lump of soil, and a flask of water, symbols of his total and complete ownership of this new land. Under English law, as sole proprietor of the colony, he could govern it however he wanted.
That's a lot of power.
Fortunately, Penn wasn't a tyrant. In accordance with his Quaker beliefs, he planned to treat all of his subjects equally and fairly, newcomers and longtime residents alike. The English, after all, were not the first people to settle in this land. Swedes and Dutch had been living here for more than 40 years, and there were small numbers of Finns, Germans, French, and Scots as well. Penn might have chosen to confiscate their land and ignore their rights. Instead, he pledged to protect their customs and property rights and let them make their own laws.
That's a pretty fair deal.
In the long run, his generosity was more than repaid. Each culture enriched Pennsylvania with their own concepts and designs. Everything from German pipe organs to Swedish log cabins.
Penn wasn't just good to the other Europeans. He was also concerned about Pennsylvania's original settlers, like the great Delaware tribe, the Lenni Lenape Indians.
I know of the injury that has been done to you by other colonizers, and I hope that I can earn your friendship. Let this be our treaty, that the houses of white men be open to Indians, and those of Indians be open to white men, and that our children shall live in peace and brotherly love, so long as the sun, the moon, and the stars shall endure.
Good for him. Too bad the other colonists didn't have that kind of an attitude.
That's true. Too many Europeans treated the Indians with hatred and scorn. In most colonies, the rights of the Indians were hardly respected. Indians were pushed from their land, often without payment.
And what did Penn do differently?
When Penn came to America, he made sure to meet with the chiefs who owned the land. He met them unarmed, and he respected their views. For each parcel of land, he paid them fairly, not in cash, but with goods. A typical land sale, called a walking purchase, was described as a parcel of land that went as far as a man could walk in 3 days. There was a certain element of trust between William Penn and the Indians, so when Penn purchased the land, he made sure to walk with both his Indian and Quaker friends. At the end of the 3 days, they all sat down together and celebrated by breaking bread.
And that's how they figured out the boundaries for the colony?
Yes, the Lenni Lenape had no written language. Instead, they wove wampum belts to help them remember the main points of their agreements. This one honors a treaty that the Lenni Lenape made with their friend and governor, William Penn. Their affection for him was genuine and continued throughout his life. The strength of that friendship protected the colony as long as the Quakers were in power.
So it was mostly Quakers who came to Pennsylvania?
At first, there were a lot of Quakers, but William Penn didn't have any one particular type of colonist in mind. Germans, Welsh, Dutch, Mennonites, Baptists, all were welcome.
And why did they all come?
They were attracted by religious freedom, democratic government, and the fertile land. People came in droves, eventually making Pennsylvania the destination of choice for many European immigrants.
Many of the newcomers settled right here in Philadelphia. They may have called it a city, but it sure wasn't London, which is exactly what Penn wanted. He thought the crowded, dirty cities of Europe were unhealthy. He himself had seen London ruined by fire and plague. Instead, He wanted Philadelphia to be a green country town. He had it laid out with public squares, large lots, and wide avenues. Penn even named the streets after trees. Ha! Hardly turned out to be a country town, did it? But Penn's idea that a city should have green spaces and an orderly layout became the pattern for many of the great cities in America.
Government, like clocks, go from the motion that men give them. Let men be good, and the government cannot be bad. And if it be ill, good men will cure it.
So if men are good, the government's good. But if men are bad...
Then it doesn't matter how good the government is, everything will fall apart.
Well, since Penn was such a good man, I'm sure he set up a good government.
He had an awful lot of good men to help him as well. The government they set up in Pennsylvania was the most democratic yet in the New World. Through their elected officials, people had real power. William Penn even allowed the legislature to have an increasingly strong voice in lawmaking, even though it was at the expense of his own authority.
Did everything have to be done the Quaker way?
Quaker values did color many of the laws in Pennsylvania. But in Puritan Massachusetts, for example, if you didn't believe what the church believed, then you could be jailed, or perhaps even executed. In Pennsylvania, on the other hand, you could follow your own religion. You didn't even have to be Quaker to vote.
So things got off to a pretty good start.
For everyone except William Penn himself. Just 2 short years after he'd come to the colony, a disagreement over the Pennsylvania-Maryland boundary forced him to go back to England. And there he stayed for 15 years. First he got into trouble with the new king and queen, William and Mary. And when he finally got that straightened out, his dear wife, Julielma, passed away. When William Penn was at last free to return to his colony, he was accompanied by his daughter Letitia and a new wife, Hannah. They came home here to Pennsbury Manor. Pennsbury was like a small, self-contained town. Everything happened here. There was a bakery where the flour was delivered and bread would be baked over a hot oven. There was a brewery where beer would be made, the favorite drink of the time period. There was also all kinds of crops and livestock here, and there was even an herb garden where herbs for seasonings and medicines would be grown. In fact, Hannah and Letitia were noted herbalists for the time period.
Did Hannah and Letitia do all that work?
No, they didn't. The Penns had their own servants. Hannah and Letitia led the comfortable lifestyle of aristocrats. In fact, they dressed the parts, only wearing the finest silks and linens.
I thought Quakers liked plain dress.
They did, and that's why so many of the other Quaker women grumbled about the fine silk and linens that Hannah and Letitia wore. But what's even more surprising for a Quaker is that William Penn had 3 African slaves.
Now that really seems to go against the Quaker ideal of equality.
Yes, it does. Penn and the Quakers really struggled with the concept of slavery, but in the end, their idealism won out. By the late 1700s, Pennsylvania became the first state to outlaw slavery.
Well, that's good, but one thing still bothers me. How could a man like Penn, who preached simplicity, live like a lord of the manor?
William Penn really was a complicated man. While he did care about democratic values and equality, he really couldn't shake off the aristocratic background he knew as a child. I think it's really important to remember when we look at William Penn from our own standpoint and find fault with him for the way he lived and the way his family lived, that when we compare him to other people in his position, he really was quite an extraordinary human being.
Only a few people lived like the Penns in Pennsylvania. And to tell you the truth, being an ordinary Quaker kid in 1690 doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun to me. If you were a girl who liked fancy hair ribbons or pretty dresses, forget about it. Plain, plain, plain. Or if you were a boy who dreamed of glory in battle, you'd better keep it to yourself. Fighting was forbidden. Music and theater? Absolutely not. Too fancy. But there were plenty of other things to do. Quakers thought idleness, just hanging out, was wrong, so kids were kept busy. There was always wood to chop, the fire to tend, water to tote, and wool to spin. They were probably glad they got to go to school. Education was very important to Penn, even though he thought his own schooling had been an awful experience.
Here in the old world, We press our children's memories too soon. We puzzle, strain, and vex them with a foreign language and rules of speech and propriety to know by heart. Children had rather be making tools and instruments of play, shaping, drawing, framing, than getting such rules.
So how did William Penn think kids should be taught?
Penn believed that kids should experience and explore the world around them. In 1689, he founded the Friends Public School, which was open to both boys and girls of all backgrounds.
They let girls go too? That's so cool.
Yes, it was. While the early Quakers weren't exactly the first feminists, they did respect women's rights more than most people of the day.
Are there still any Quaker schools?
Yes, there are. In fact, the school that William Penn started over 300 years ago still continues to this day. Enlightened education isn't the only area where Penn was ahead of his time. Long before the American Revolution, he proposed that the existing colonies should be united. He also envisioned an organization where all the nations of the world would come together to settle disputes peacefully.
Do the words United Nations ring any bells? It's like he could see the future.
Well, that's true, but I'm afraid that William Penn couldn't see his own future as well. You see, Penn had to return to England just 2 years into his second trip to America. He had trusted some poor financial advisors and made some bad business deals. In fact, William Penn ended up in prison again, this time for being in debt. Unfortunately, he suffered a stroke in 1712 and died 6 years later, far from his beloved Pennsylvania. When Penn died, the Lenni Lenape sent his widow a gift of wild animal skins for a cloak. This garment, they explained, would protect her while passing through the thorny wilderness without her guide. Hannah served as Pennsylvania's proprietor until 1727, when Penn's sons were ready to take over the colony's governance. Unfortunately, they proved unworthy of their inheritance. They cheated the Indians who Penn had befriended. They even made a mockery of his famous walking purchase. This time, the walker ran and claimed far more land than was fair.
Did his children undo everything Penn had done?
No, William Penn's noble vision outlived them all. He was one of a kind, a Quaker, a scholar, a lawyer, a city planner. But even more than that, William Penn was a man of action who was willing to give up everything to realize his principles. And so, dear friends, I salute you all, praying that peace and love richly abound. Thy friend in truth, William Penn.
William Penn's ideals became a part of what is best about our American system. The rest, as they say, is history. And so am I. See ya!